I am Pat Snipes. I'm the founder and director of the Vibrant Health Association, which is the sponsor of this event and of the Before Slavery exhibition. So special thanks to our moderator, Miss Modesta Campinda. She's an extraordinary young lady. She's a valued part of the Before Slavery team. She's a graduate of Spelman College with a degree in international studies, political science, and government. And she's very involved in energy distribution and sustainability. Modesta speaks 6 languages and she's well-traveled. And she hails from Zimbabwe, where she is currently today. She's presenting from there, and we welcome Modesta.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pat, for giving me the opportunity and the honor. It's an honor and privilege to be moderating this panel discussion. I am really grateful to our Lord and Savior and for giving me this opportunity to share and to learn and also to speak to my brothers and sisters, aunties and uncles who are in the United States about matters of importance to them. So today we'll be interviewing Dr. Theron Williams. Thank you for giving us an opportunity to interview you. So Dr. Theron Williams has been a pastor at Mount Carmel Church in Indianapolis for 30 years, and he is a native of Detroit, Michigan. He is an alumnus of Virginia Union University and the Samuel Dewitt Proctor School of Theology at Virginia Union. He earned a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Divinity degree, respectively. He's also a graduate of the Chicago Theological Seminary, where he received a Doctor of Ministry degree. So he has 2 titles, Doctor and Reverend, which I found to be amazing. So as you have heard before, he's the founder and president of the Black History Institute, and its mission is to educate communities of African descent on their biblical heritage. He's the author of 12 books, and today we're going to be focusing on his current book, which is the main book. The Bible is Black History. And this book was first launched in 2018, and he has been working on a 2nd edition, which is going to be launched this year. Dr. Theron Williams, has the 2nd edition of the book already came out?
Oh yeah, the 2nd edition came out a couple of months ago, yeah.
All right, okay, great. So it already came out, the 2nd edition. So Dr. Williams, I just want to dive right into it and ask you this question, because it's a really unique and interesting topic, and it's really rare to hear anyone who is in the Christian faith, especially in ministry, talking about something so revolutionary, a revolutionary topic. So what really happened, and what first opened you up to this area of research?
Well, I described in the preface of the 2nd edition how young people were defecting from the church. And this was several years ago, and I thought it was a Mount Carmel. My church is Mount Carmel. I thought it was unique to Mount Carmel. And I'm trying to figure out, why are our young people leaving the church and not coming back? And so I got concerned. So I called a meeting with the young adult population just to figure out what was going on with them. You know, we had young people who had left to go to college, and normally, well, I've been at my church 33 years. Normally, when they leave college, they come back. Those who return to the city come back to the church because we support them throughout college. You know, we had a summer day camp, and when the kids would come home, they had jobs already waiting on them, summer jobs, and we would have care packages sent to them, scholarships and all of that. So we were very, very supportive of our kids. But we found out they were coming back to Indianapolis, but they were returning to the church. And those who did not leave town to go to college, but stayed in the city, they had defected too. So I'm like, what's going on? So I called them all together and we had a meeting. We just talked. And I thought it was something that I was doing, something that displeased them, some decisions that I may have made as pastor. But they didn't have any issues with me at all. They had issues with, they had theological issues. They questioned the authenticity of the Bible. You know, they started saying that the Bible was a book written by white men to suppress Black people in slavery. It was used as a tool of oppression. They questioned the efficacy of the church. They said the Black church has seen its glory days, and the glory days of the Black church is behind them now. That the Black church was important through slavery as it held our people together. The Black church was important through Reconstruction, where it was a place where we galvanized for support and encouragement. The church was great during the Jim Crow era and the Civil Rights era. In fact, the Civil Rights movement in America emerged from the Black church. But they say today's church, it has lost its meaning, it has outlived its purpose, and that the Black church is not needed anymore. And then finally, they even question the historicity of Jesus. You know, many of us say that Jesus is a recreation of the mythical goddess Horus that predated Jesus. They talk about how their lives parallel and are similar to one another. And if Horus predated Jesus and their lives parallel, then that means Jesus was an invention of the Roman government. So they had all this stuff going on. So I said to them, you know, allow me the opportunity to do a 4-week Bible study. We'll meet once a week on Wednesday, and then we can walk through this stuff that you guys are dealing with. And I can challenge and perhaps even refute some of the issues and notions that you have about Christ, about the church, about the Bible. And so they came, showed up, and that 4-week Bible study turned into a 7-month Bible study.
Wow.
Kept asking questions, and as I dug more into it, more stuff started to unearth. And after the Bible study was over, I challenged a lot of what they said and refuted, and they were appreciative of it. Many of them returned to the church, and they encouraged me because they bought the CDs and all of that of the teaching. And so they encouraged me, Dr. Williams, you really need to put this in book form. And so I put it in book form and published it. And it addressed not only the needs of my church. I didn't know young people across the world were thinking the same thing. You know, it was good in that it addressed those needs, and people are able to read it and they really appreciate it.
I really do appreciate it as well. So thank you so much for your work. So what inspired the title, The Bible is Black History, and what message does the title try to communicate?
Well, I visited Israel some years ago, and I was quite disturbed at what I saw. I saw all of these white people in Israel, and they were supposed to be God's chosen people, and they were supposed to be the descendants of the biblical Hebrews. And I'm looking at it, and I know that biblical Israel was a part of the continent of Africa. Palestine, if you look at a map today, Palestine, if you look at a map today, Israel, because they drew the map. So Israel is way north of Egypt, and then there is blank space unnamed on maps. And I wanted to know, what is this blank space that share a natural border with Egypt? Find out that that blank space is Palestine. And then the Palestine would have been the southern kingdom. And in the southern kingdom of Israel, you have Bethlehem, you have Judah, you have Shiloh, you have Hebron, you have all of these biblical names, but you don't see that on today's map, and it's a natural border with Egypt. So looking at the definition of a continent, which is a contiguous landmass, if Israel is connected to Egypt, and Egypt is on the continent of Africa, that would put Israel on the continent of Africa, making it an African nation.
That's right.
And so when you look at that, of course, in 1859, you have the creation of the Suez Canal, when that strip of land that connected Israel physically to Egypt, that was removed to create the canal so that ships coming in from the Mediterranean would have access to the Red Sea. It was for shipping purposes. It had nothing to do with trying to separate Israel from Egypt or anything like that. It was totally for shipping purpose, for economic purposes. Nevertheless,
I just thought I would put
there we go. There you have it. Nevertheless, you still have Israel now disconnected from Egypt. And so they created this fictitious, socially constructed name called the Middle East, which did not exist. The Middle East, that term came into the English lexicon at the late 19th century, early 20th century. And even then it was created to designate the space between Arabia and India. But later on, that whole concept began to spread. The Middle idea began to spread and explode to embrace many of the Asian and African countries. So when I look at the Middle East, when I think about the Middle East, there is no Middle East. That's a social construct. Israel is on the continent of Africa. It's connected to Egypt, so it fits the definition of an African nation. And I tell people all the time, if Ethiopians are called Africans, if Nigerians are called Africans, if Egyptians are called Africans, how come Israelites are not called Africans? Since their land is physically connected to the continent of Africa. And so, since Israel is connected to the continent of Africa, that would make Israel on the northeast corner of the continent of Africa, which would make the Israelites Northern Africans.
Wow.
The Bible is Black history in the sense that it was written by Northern Africans. The heroes of the Bible are Northern Africans. These were people of color. These were African people.
Wow, that is totally revolutionary. I'd never looked at it in that perspective, especially I'm a millennial. So Israel as a state was created in after World War II in 1945, 1946. So these maps were redrawn before I was even born. I have never thought about Israel as a northeastern African country. And this right here just changes everything, because if Israel is connected to Egypt and it's just separated by a river, that must imply that there's a lot of shared history going backwards in centuries, between Egypt and Israel, as well as Ethiopia and the whole eastern part of Africa. So there's a lot of historical artifacts, archaeology that has been found in Egypt. And given that these two spaces were connected before they were separated by artificial borders, are there any ancient catacombs that were found or archaeological evidence that is present to kind of evidence this connection and the link of Black people to the biblical Israel?
Mm-hmm.
And if there are any catacombs or archaeological evidence, artifacts, what kind of images were there? And can you share them?
DNA evidence. In South Africa, the Limbo tribe, there was a study done on the Limbo tribes in South Africa, and their DNA traces back to Israel, probably connected to Aaron, who was Moses' brother, which is the descendancy of the priesthood. Now, that's in Southern Africa. And then in Ethiopia, you have people who have genes or DNA that connect them to Israel. And then in Tunisia, there was a study that was just released that in AD 70, after the destruction of the temple, when Rome came in and destroyed the temple and killed many of the Hebrews that were living in Israel, many of them fled. Now you have some historians who would say they fled north to Europe, but that doesn't make sense since the Europeans were coming from Europe to crush them. Why would I run in the direction where the enemy is coming? I would run further southwest into Africa. And DNA bears that out because there is a gene pool, a gene flow from Israel to Tunisia that dated back to 70 AD. So I point out in my book that in 70 AD, many of the Hebrews in Israel fled Israel and they went southwest, deeper into Africa. I didn't know where they settled, but now DNA proved that they settled in Tunisia. A lot of things that have not been explained, and DNA science is still evolving and developing. But there's a lot of things that have not been explained. Number one, in Nigeria, the Igbos of Nigeria boast of being the oldest known Hebrew tribe in the world.
Wow.
The Igbos were practicing Judaism in Nigeria before before they had a Bible and before any of the missionaries came over to Africa. They were practicing Judaism. They were practicing celebration of the new moon. They were circumcising their boys on the 8th day. They were getting married under a canopy. They mourned the dead for 7 days. They worshiped on the Sabbath, and many other uniquely Old Testament religious traditions. They were practicing that in Nigeria among the Igbos without a Bible and without missionaries. How did they know? How did they to circumcise their boys on the 8th day? Who told them? They don't have a Bible, and the missionaries haven't been there yet. How did they know that? Nobody has been able to explain that, but we do know that was going on. If you look at, I'm gonna think of the name of he's the foremost scholar in Jewish African identity, and he talks about.
Wow, that is interesting because in our last webinar, where we interviewed scholars who are doing research on, who did research on a journal of a German barber surgeon who was working on Dutch slave ships in the transatlantic slave trade. He wrote a journal and he would give descriptions of the people he met along the coast. So they mentioned that there were people who were Moors, but he being not familiar with the area, described black people who seemed to be Hebrew, but were not Hebrew. But he did not really delve into that, and the scholar, we realized that it is a gray area of research to really figure out those people. He was curious to know who were they. They were Jewish, they seemed Hebrew, but they were not the Hebrew that he knew, or Jewish, but they looked Hebrew, they dressed like Hebrew people, but they were Moors. But he could not name them because it was new to him to see that. And it was along the coast of West Africa. So I think that is a very interesting area of research that could be interesting, especially to us young millennials who are really interested in this topic.
Yeah,
So,
there is a connection. I'm convinced there is a connection. I don't know that the connection is, we're not sure what that connection is, but there's some connection. You know, it may not be DNA, but the ancient West Africans in some way was connected to the Hebrews of the Bible. And like you said, that's a fertile ground for further research.
And also we know that in ancient times, people migrated a lot. They moved from one place to another easily. I'm based in Zimbabwe. That's where the Limbo people are, in the southern part of Zimbabwe. And from what I learned in history, we know that certain tribes in Zimbabwean ethnicities migrated from the north. Though, unfortunately, in African history, we don't have written records. It's always oral tradition, and oral tradition can be lost over hundreds and hundreds of years. But we definitely know that a sizable population of Zimbabweans who are in the country right now migrated from North Africa going south. And the Lemba also say that they migrated from the north. And the mystery behind the great Zimbabwe ruins is that it has archaeological features that can be categorized as North African. That is also can be historical evidence of the migrations that were happening back in the ancient times. So what biblical examples do we have that evidently show that the Israelites of the Bible were people of color?
Well, first of all, color was not an issue with the biblical writers. In fact, this whole question of race was never even an issue with anybody since the foundation, since the origin of humanity. Race was not even a thing. Race became a thing in colonial America. It is when they brought us from West Africa to the Americas, forced us into slavery, but they also brought poor white people from Europe and forced them into indentured servitude. And so you had the enslaved African, and you had just a cut above the European indentured servant. So the indentured servant and the enslaved African had more in common with one another than the white indentured servant had with the ruling class. And there were several instances where the enslaved and the indentured servant joined forces to fight against the ruling class aristocrat white, and they had great success doing it. Well, the whites got smart and said, we need to separate these people. You know, we need to separate the indigenous service whites from the enslaved Africans, and they did it based on color.
Wow.
And that is the origin of race. It is in America. Race is an American invention. It is when they put the color of the skin in hierarchy. They created a social caste system, a hierarchical system of humanity where white people were at the top of the hierarchy, and black people were at the bottom of the hierarchy. And the other races occupied the interim space between the whites at the top and the blacks at the bottom. That's when race became a thing. You can't have racism without race. You know, they coexist, they came together. So race and racism are woven into the DNA of our nation here in the United States. That's why it's not going anywhere. No more than my brown eyes are not going anywhere. I don't care. I can cover them up with contacts. My dark skin, I can lighten it up with skin lightener. You know, the texture of my hair is not going to change. I can put chemicals in it to straighten it out. Nevertheless, it is what it is, and it's not going anywhere. And racism, you can cover it up. You can put skin lightener, bleaching cream on it. You can put chemicals on it, but it's not going. It is here. It is here to stay because it's a part of the DNA of our culture. So race and color was not a thing. It was not an issue in the Bible days. But we do know that there is a description given of Jesus in the book of the Revelation. I believe it's Revelation 2, I think. Revelation 2, if I'm not mistaken, where it describes his feet were like burnt brass. His hair was white like wool. His eyes were red. His eyes were like flames of fire. Now, a lot of times when white theologians and white biblicists read that, they say, oh, it's just symbolic. The feet burnt like brass symbolizes something. The hair white like wool symbolizes something different and all of that. But I promise you, and I'm not a betting man, but if I were, if that text had said, and his feet were like polished ivory, and his hair was white and long like silk, they would have said that's a description of Jesus's color. But since it said feet burnt like brass and his hair white, that's color, wool, that's texture.
Right.
John is describing Jesus. So nobody can tell me that there is not a physical description of Jesus in the Bible. John gave us one. John said, I saw the resurrected Christ, and his hair was white like wool. And if they had other descriptions available, they could have said his hair was white like silk, or they could have said his hair was white like as if it had been bleached. Those words were available to the writer because those words are used in the Bible. So if the writer wanted to describe his hair as something else, he would have used that description. But he said wool, which describes the texture of the man's hair. And he said feet burnt like brass. Now, it also talks about in the Bible, it doesn't talk about skin color per se, but it talks about, when it does talk about skin color, it talks about people's skin turning white as a result of leprosy. So when the Bible does talk about skin color, it talks about the dreadful skin disease of leprosy. Now, leprosy in the Bible is different from the leprosy that we know of today. Leprosy is Hansen's disease. It's a nerve-ending disease that cripples and deforms the body. You don't have that description of leprosy in the Bible. The description that we have in the Bible of leprosy is blotches on your skin and your skin turning white. Moreover, it's more likely talking about the skin disease of vitiligo, the skin disease that Michael Jackson suffered from that turned his skin white.
Mm.
So when we talk about leprosy in the Bible, we're not talking about Hansen's disease today. We're mostly talking about vitiligo. Like these people were losing their skin color, their skin melanin, and turning white. They were put in quarantine away from the rest of society because they believed that it was contagious. You know, so if they're going to quarantine people with vitiligo because their skin had turned white, if that was a white population, it would have been easy for these people whose skin had turned white to escape from the colony, from the leper colony, and rejoin the general population because everybody's skin would have been white. It would have been difficult for them to, to be distinct. So the Bible does not talk about skin color per se because skin color was not an issue with biblical people and no other people. Skin color became an issue with the creation of the United States of America. It's a United States of America phenomenon. So that's number one. The second point, since we know that Israel is on the continent of Northern Africa, that would suggest to us that the biblical people were people of color, Black people from Africa.
Right.
Thirdly, when we look at the origin of modern humans and that study that was done by Dr. Kane, anyway, Dr. Kane, she did her study. She was looking for the mother of modern human, whom the Bible identifies as Eve. Looking for the mother of modern human. She began to study the mitochondrial DNA. And all of us have mitochondrial DNA in our cells, but only women can pass it on to the next generation. So she studied and traced the mitochondrial DNA, and she used 17 people from indigenous countries around the world. And it traced all the way back between 100 and 200,000 years ago in southeastern Africa.
Wow.
And she concluded that the mother of humanity, whom the Bible identifies as Eve, is a Black woman from Southeast Africa. They created a bus. They unearthed skull fragments from that time period and created a bust of Eve. Right, now that's Eve. That's the depiction. They unearthed the skull, and Dr. Kane and her team created, and they just didn't throw this together. They had anthropologists and criminologists, and they had everybody working on this. And this is what they came up with: the image of, they call her Mitochondrial Eve, because she's the mother of modern humans, whom the Bible identifies as Eve, the mother of modern human. There she is right there. And they did the same thing with Adam in 2005. Dr. Spencer Wells and his team, they studied the Y chromosome and traced it back to Eastern Africa. Can you see that?
Right.
The same thing. And they came up with this bus of Adam, the father of modern humans. And so here's what you have: Adam and Eve.
Even the color of his eyes,
The
eye color.
And when you read the genealogies in the Bible, they are the Hebrews are the only people who trace their origin back to Adam. When I do my genealogy, I don't trace all the way back to Adam, but the Hebrews in the Bible trace theirs all the way back to these two people. Not to these two people. It's impossible for two white people to give birth to a Black person. because white people have recessive genes. Black people have dominant genes. And so if Adam and Eve look like these two people, none of us on this Zoom call would be in the world today because they can't produce Black people. But these two people can. And they produce Black people in the form of albinos. And I get into my book, The Origin of White People. Obviously, white people came from Black people because Black people can't come from white people. So now when you look at the Jews that we have, now first of all, the Jewishness is not a race.
Right.
So I want us to get that out of our mind. Jewishness is not a race. Jewishness is a religion.
Right.
And I described earlier that race is a social construct created in America. It was not even a thing. It's a social construct that was developed and thought through and put in place in America. So according to America, race is defined by a subsection of the human species who are grouped together according to basic characteristics, similar characteristics: hair color, eye color, hair texture, vocal voice, body type. That puts you in a group that we call a race. So all Black people are in a race. All white people are in a race. All red people is a race. Yellow people race. Brown people a race. Okay, if that's what race means, how can you have a Jewish person, one person, white as chalk, hair straight and oily, with a thin nose, thin lips, and a unique shaped head, and that person calls him or herself a Jew, and yet you can have another Jew whose skin is black as coal, hair is short, dry, and curly, broad nose, and thick lips, and that person is calling himself a Jew. So that's proof that Jewishness is not a race. Because if it was, all Jewish people would look just alike. They would have similar characteristics. You can't have a white Jew and then have a Black Jew and then call Jewishness a race. It's not a race. Jewish is a religion, just like Christianity is a religion, Buddhism is a religion, Hindu is a religion, Islam is a religion, and Jewishness is a religion.
Wow.
You know.
And it's really interesting how Jewishness is being racialized, because it is said that when a Black person migrates and moves to today's Israel and claims the religion, they are treated as third-class citizens, and they have to take an examination of some sort to qualify them to be Jewish, and they never make it. So you can see that already Jewishness is being racialized. Oh, you're not white, so you're going to take a couple of number of tests to prove or to qualify to practice our religion and live in this country. That's very interesting.
So if it's a race, you don't have to go through all of that. My two children didn't have to take a test to prove they were Black people. You know, that they were part of the African American race. They had to take a test.
Wow.
Because they get it through birth.
Wow.
And so the white Jews that we see, the Barbra Streisands and the Seinfeld and the others that we see, and many people want to make them God's chosen people and the descendants from the biblical Hebrews. When you look at their genealogy, and not genealogy, but their DNA, trace them back to Eastern Europe.
Right.
It doesn't trace them back to Israel. Now, it may trace some of them back to the Levant, and the Levant consists of Afghanistan, Syria, Iran, Iraq, Arabia, Egypt, Israel, and there are some white Jews who say my DNA traced back to the Levant. Just because it traces back to the Levant doesn't mean it traces back to Israel. I mean, say for example, my DNA traced back to the Midwest. You got Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Missouri. You got several Midwestern states. Just because my DNA traces back to the Midwest doesn't necessarily mean I'm from Detroit, Michigan. I could be from anywhere. So you have these Jews who are arguing that since my DNA traces back to the Levant, that's proof that I am from Israel, that I am a descendant from the people of Israel, and that's just not so. Most of their DNA trace back to Eastern Europe.
Wow.
During
Wow.
after the war, the Second World War, and during the time of Adolf Hitler, because of the anti-Semitic sentiments that was in Europe at that time, many quote unquote Jews or Eastern Europeans started leaving Europe. Many of them came to the United States, some of them went to Canada, some of them went to Israel. You know, and since they were adherers of Judaism, and that's the origin of Judaism is in Israel, they went there and settled and convinced themselves somehow that they were the descendants of the biblical Hebrews. It's the biggest instance of identity theft in human history.
Wow. That is very interesting. And now that you talk about it, I put the pieces together because it's the issue of Israel is really hot on global politics and affairs right now, because it has been politicized in order to justify occupation of a country by using identity to occupy a country. So I find that really interesting. Thank you for bringing that to light. And to the attendees, if you have just joined us, the Before Slavery exhibition presents Dr. and Reverend Theron Williams, who is the author of the book, The Bible is Black History, and many other books as well. You may find Dr. Williams' books on his website, thebibleisblackhistory.com. And please, if you're already logged in, stay tuned in until the end of the webinar, and would kindly ask you to answer the survey questions and stand a chance to win a Before Slavery t-shirt, which will be shipped to you if you're in the United States. Thank you. So please, please, please do answer the survey. Your feedback is important to us, and stay till the end. So going back into our discussion, Dr. Williams, what should we do differently now that we know that the Bible is Black history? What can our community do? How can we take advantage of this newfound knowledge?
Well, it brings a different view to the Bible. I mean, we should read it differently. The Bible text is not going to change, but the way we understand the stories, now that we see ourselves, Black people, who are the champions of salvation history. I mean, we look at Moses now. He's no longer Charleston Heston, you know, but he's a brother. You know, we look at Samson, and he's a brother. We look at Jesus Christ, he's a brother. You know, we look at the disciples, they are brothers. And
right.
One of the things that's interesting to me is I've been teaching as I go around, you know, well, I had been traveling the country, you know, before this pandemic. And one of the things that comes up is this whole question of hermeneutics. And hermeneutics is the method by which we understand the Bible. Hermeneutics, I describe it as glasses that we put on to read the Bible. So if someone is nearsighted, you know, they will put on their glasses to see in distance. If somebody is farsighted, they will put on their glasses to see up close. So the realities don't change, but the lenses through which they understand their reality is what makes it look different. A couple of years ago, one of my employees at our church came into the building on Sunday morning. She came to the sanctuary and she was complaining about how dark it was in the sanctuary. I mean, she was going off, you know, somebody needs to turn the light on. This is the house of God. It needs to be light in here. It's dark, it's dim, it's gloomy, blah, blah, blah. And I thought she was joking because it was obvious to me that I thought she was joking. So she goes to the building superintendent and says, "Can you please turn up the lights because it's too dark in here?" The superintendent said to her, "Well, if you take off your sunglasses, the room is not dark." The sun, because she had on those progressive lenses that when you go outside, it gets dark. You come back in time, it gets light. Her lenses hadn't had a chance to lighten up so that she can view the reality of the room more clearly. That's what we do with the Bible. We put on these glasses, these hermeneutics, and we understand the Bible the way white evangelicals have conditioned us to understand the Bible. So we have to change our hermeneutics so that when we're looking at Jesus and studying Jesus, we have to study Jesus in the context of his historical reality. What we do is we take Jesus out of his historical reality and put him in 21st century America and make him a white man and make him a Republican and put him on the side of Donald Trump and make it as if the only thing he cares about is abortion and same-sex marriage. But if you understand Jesus in his historical context, Jesus was living under oppression because Rome had colonized Israel. Jesus was at the bottom of his hierarchy, of his caste. He was at the bottom rung. Jesus faced oppression and discrimination, much like Black people in the United States face oppression and discrimination. So now when you read the Bible from that perspective, especially the story of Jesus, everything changes. You begin to see stuff in it that you didn't see because you're reading it with white evangelical hermeneutic. And so when we talk about the Bible being the history of Black people and that the stars of the Bible were Black people, it should give Black people, it should be empowering to Black people so that we understand this is our story. This is us. This is where we came from. Our people won this. Because heretofore, we were thinking that we were Gentiles and that we were on the sideline of history while white people won salvation for us and then gave it to us. No, we were the authors and the actors in salvation history. We gave the world salvation history.
Wow.
So when we understand the Bible from that perspective, it's empowering. That's why I wrote children's books with images of Black heroes so that our children can understand it from the beginning. I got a friend who used to work at a bank, and he said the way they taught them how to identify counterfeit money is to never show them counterfeit money, only show them the real thing. So that when something counterfeit comes across, something will click and they will know it's counterfeit. So if we can raise our children with Black images of the people of the Bible and get that in their little spirits, when something else comes up, they'll know it's counterfeit from the beginning. And I wish I had this. I've been in church my entire life. And I wish I had this information when I was a kid. It would have changed everything for me.
Right.
So yeah, you ask, how should we deal with it differently? This is how we should deal with it and how it impacts us, understanding that the Bible is a book about Black genius.
So you say that we can start now identifying with biblical characters, with the biblical heroes. And it's even mentioned in the book that Paul himself was mistaken for an Egyptian. And
Yes.
mentioned Jesus, you've mentioned Samson. And now that you talk about it, it makes sense, even their physical appearance, that Samson was a big man, muscular, he stood out, and his hair was locks. There were locks of hair. His hair, only Black people have hair that naturally locks, and it will be outstanding, you know. So, wow, this is amazing. And the persecution of disciples as they traveled throughout continents to preach the word of God, they were easily targeted and killed, maybe not because only they were preaching the word of God and the word of Jesus Christ and the gospel, but probably also because they were different when they entered these new spaces in terms of their skin color or their ethnicity. It's just is really, really interesting. So what documentation or literature would you recommend to us millennials and other people who are interested in reading this topic further? Because we rely on the internet and fake news, and that's why most of us have been disheartened and we're moving away from the church. It's because we are being bombarded by the Egyptian ideology that, the Bible was derived or stolen from Egyptian history. However, it could be a different story if we had in our hands, or we had the knowledge or where to seek the more accurate, fact-based, history-based, scientifically based information. So which researchers or writers would you recommend?
You want to know what additional books is that what you're asking?
Right, books or research papers.
Okay, there is a book, and I recommend this, of course, besides my book, The Bible of Black History. There is a book by the late Dr. Kane Hofelder. He was a professor, I believe, at Princeton, and then he went to Howard University after he wrote a book called Troubling Biblical Waters.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I haven't affirmed this with Dr. Felder. He passed away now, but people suggest that it was that book that was published, and then Princeton started putting pressure on him to leave. He left and he went to Howard University in DC, and he spent the rest of his career at Howard University. That book cut across the traditional grain of Western biblical theology so much that it made people at Princeton uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
So the Felder left Princeton and went to Howard. Troubling Biblical Waters is an excellent. And then there is another piece that I recently read called The Politics of Jesus by Aubry, Hendricks. And that book is it blew me away. I mean, away, because it talked about Jesus's community, and it talked about the politic that Jesus lived under. It talked about the oppression. And then when you look at the teaching of Jesus based upon that backdrop, his teachings change, you know, because he's now teaching to oppressed people, poor people, people who are trying to make it living under the oppression of the Europeans. Similar.
A case of social justice back in the day.
Yeah, the same thing. So it makes Jesus' teaching more relevant to us as people of African descent living in America. So those are two pieces that I would highly recommend. Now, they are slow reading. They're not easy reading like the Bible and Black History. Second,
You have to digest.
Yeah. But those guys are much heavier, you know, and it's a little more complicated, but it's good stuff. It's good reading. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for those recommendations. I'm sure the attendees have taken note of the book. So just one last question. Why really is your work dedicated to young Black people? Maybe it might be a little bit repetitive, but why have you dedicated so much energy into young Black people?
They're our future, you know, and if the Black church and our Black religion is going to move forward, because we're at an inflection point in our country right now. You know, I mean, things will never be the same after this pandemic, after Donald Trump, and after all of the protests that we had this past summer. We're at an inflection point. This world, this country won't be the same going forward. Mm-hmm. Secondly, we have been reduced to social media for everything now. I mean, for church worship, for church meetings, it's been Zoom for that, it's been Facebook Live for that. So our people have become accustomed and perhaps comfortable with worshiping online without having to go to the church. So we're at a transition point. Mm-hmm. There is also a transition point in theology. There's a theological revolution because young people are not buying that white evangelical theology. They're just not buying it, especially when they have seen how white evangelicals back Donald Trump, who is the most corrupt president we've ever had. He's not a good person at all. He's selfish. He's evil. Mm. He only cares about himself. Mm. And that's obvious that he would tear the country up before he turns power over. Mm. We've seen him brag about assaulting women. We've seen his racism. We've seen his xenophobia, and he doesn't even attempt to hide it. It's out there. And yet you have these white evangelicals, 94% backing Donald Trump. And so our young people are looking at this, and they're looking at the church saying that the Black church is like that. And we're backpedaling. No, that's not us. We're not like that. But at the same time, we're using the same white theology to preach in our churches that those white theologians use to justify Donald Trump. So we're at an inflection point. We're at a crossroads. So that the theology has to change. The hermeneutic with which we understand the Bible has to change. And our Black people need to understand that the Bible is a book about a history of a people of color. Mm-hmm. And so I need to get that in the spirit of our people. You know, it's important.
It has to be a movement.
It has to be a movement. That's right. It's more than a book. It's a movement.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for such a revelation. I learned a lot today, and I hope the attendees also as well. Remember, everyone, if you'd like to purchase Dr. Williams' book, you may go on his website. The Bible is blackhistoryinstitute.com.
The Bible, just Bible is Black BibleIsBlackHistory.com. There's no dot, just Bible is Black History.
Right. And you may see his work and purchase his books there. Thank you for that correction. I will hand over to Miss Pat Snaps right now.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. We thoroughly enjoyed everything that you shared with us today. And certainly, hopefully, our guests have food for thought and maybe are prompted to go and do some research, to read your book, to look at the scriptures, and maybe see things in a different light. And thank you to Modesta for all of your help. I encourage everyone to please visit the website, BibleIsBlackHistory.com. At the end of this, you will be asked to complete a survey. Please do that for us. It'll be very helpful so that we can continue to bring more material to you in the future. The exhibition Before Slavery is coming along very nicely. There's still lots for us to build. We still need your help to build it. So please commit a tax-deductible contribution at our website, beforeslavery.com. And those who become monthly contributors, you'll be invited to our grand opening with a free admission, and you also receive thank you gifts. Business owners, please leave a note in the chat, please. There are opportunities to partner with us for the Before Slavery exhibition, ways that we can be of help to each other. So thank you again to Dr. Williams. Thank you again to Modesta, our moderator, and thank you to each one of you that have come out today and heard this revolutionary information. We hope to see you at the next webinar. Stay blessed. Have an awesome weekend.
Bless you.
Bless you. Thank you. Have a great week, everyone.
All right, take care.